Thanks so much for joining us here on Unfiltered today. There are many proposed projects for new pipelines to transport oil in this province. Enbridge and Kinder Morgan both have strong bases of opposition to their plans, but a new report from the Fraser Institute finds that pipelines are the safest way to move crude. Kenneth Green from the Fraser Institute joins us with more on their findings. Kenneth, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can you sum up for me what you found in this study?
Sure. Basically, we got data from the Transportation Safety Board and from Transport Canada on the rail and pipeline movement of oil and gas. And we worked with that data to be able to create a clear comparison as to which mode had higher risk when moving a certain amount of oil within in a year, over a year. And when you do that comparison, what you find is there's more than 4.5 incidents or problems, as it were, with rail transport of a certain amount of oil and gas, as would be the case with pipelines.
What kind of amount of oil are we talking about here? Because you suggest there was a minimum amount.
Well, there is quite a large amount of oil is being moved. 15 times more oil moves in pipelines than in rail for the period we looked at, from 2003 to 2013. I don't actually have the volumes written down, the amount written down, but it's of course, as everyone knows, it's a major quantity of oil and gas that are moved.
And what did you find? How many more incidents were there?
Well, one thing to understand is, of course, both modes of transport are relatively safe, and that 99% or better of product you put in at one end will get out the other end without a problem. But what we found is that again, if you put a certain amount of fuel into a pipeline or a certain amount of oil or gas into a pipeline, and you move it across country and within a year, and you do the same thing by pipeline, there's 4.5 times more likelihood of bad event with using rail rather than a pipeline.
When there is a pipeline spill, does it tend to be worse? Do they sort of cancel each other out by the severity of the spills?
That's a good question, and it's actually a question we would dearly love to answer, but there isn't available. There isn't data available on the quantity spilled by rail. There is availability of that data for pipelines, so we can't really make the comparison. What we can say is that it turns out very few, most pipeline spills release less than 1 cubic meter of oil, which is 73% of the pipeline occurrences had spills less than 1 cubic meter, and 16% didn't cause any spills whatsoever.
We've got these results.
Well, the other interesting thing is that most of the spills that happen, 83%, most of the incidences that happen, don't actually happen in transit. They happen in the stations where the oil and gas are loaded or transferred. And those facilities generally have safeguards in place to prevent environmental contamination and to allow remediation.
What do you think we should do with this information now that we have it?
Well, on the presumption that we are going to continue to be an energy-consuming society, which there's really no alternative to for the foreseeable future, we have to decide how we're going to responsibly move the hydrocarbons we depend on every day and that we seek to export to build our economy. We have to figure out how we're going to move those most safely. Right now, because of the political opposition to pipelines, we are making the tacit decision to move it by rail, which is a less safe way for both people and the environment. And hopefully policymakers will take the information we've produced, add it into their considerations of what's the best way to move oil and what infrastructure is best, roadways versus railways versus pipelines, and optimize the safety for humans and the environment as we move forward, moving our environmental natural resource endowment around.
You said earlier that ultimately both methods are safe, but do you think that just the slight advantage that pipelines have means we should be transporting more by pipeline, or is the difference just very slim?
No, it's a significant difference because of the larger volume moved by pipelines, where you have a considerably higher risk moving it by rail. And second to that, the rail by design goes through metropolitan centers because that's where you want to deliver goods. Pipelines are fixed infrastructure that go around metropolitan areas. So it's hard to compare the damage done in an incident on pipeline and rail, but we know they're significant enough to favor pipelines. Companies would prefer to use pipelines if the capacity is available, and we know that from the investment that they're making in it, and also from the fact that it's less expensive to move oil by pipeline than it is by rail as well.
Kenneth Green from the Fraser Institute, we appreciate your time in explaining these results to us.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
And the Canadian Energy Research Initiative says that moving oil by rail could actually double or triple in Canada in the next 8 years. And the organization is disagreeing with the Fraser Institute's report. Peter Howard joins us with more on their research and perspective. Peter, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
When you hear that pipelines are safer than rail, do you agree?
Yes, I do. Absolutely agree.
Why do you think that is, so why are we going to increase the amount of crude being moved by rail in this country?
It's a simple fact that our export pipelines, which are primarily connected to the United States, although we do have the export pipeline going out through Vancouver, but all of these pipelines are in fact close to their capacity if they are not at their capacity now. So the implication being, if we cannot build a new pipeline, and that's either south, west, or east, then rail is the next logical option to move crude products to market. Let me just suggest one thing here. If you are going to move crude in a rail container, it is far better to move bitumen in the rail rather than light crudes. Put the light crudes into a pipeline. And again, that has to do with the safety aspect. Light crudes in a closed container like a rail car, if it does rupture, it becomes explosive and burnable in nature. Bitumen in a closed container like a rail car would probably just ooze out and probably would not ignite. So that's a safety aspect.
With some of these pipelines that exist already, is it as simple as simply changing what goes through it, or is that a too simplistic an approach?
It's a little on the simplistic side. However, with that being said, we have two major locations in Alberta, that being Edmonton and Hardisty, where the gathering tank farms are located. So basically all the bitumen, all the conventional crudes, light and heavy, come to those locations, are put into tanks, and then are injected into the pipeline. Now, at both those locations, we have rail terminals now that are under construction, will be coming online. So those tanks will actually load trains and load pipelines at the same time. The issue is the owner of the fluid itself. One particular owner may have contracted space on the pipeline, so it doesn't matter what he is producing, he's going to put it in that pipeline because he's paying for it. Another producer who may have production that he can't get onto the pipeline will take the second choice, which is the rail method. And whether it's heavy crude, light crude, whatever, he'll put it into the rail car and send it to market.
We have seen here in BC lots of opposition to pipelines being built. Do you think that is ultimately a mistake and we should be putting our efforts in that? Or do you think the increase in rail is going to continue to be safe and that's the smart way to move forward?
Two aspects to that particular question. We actually took a look at the potential for increased volumes on rail, and we imagined that the bulk of this was going to head southbound into the United States. The net result is, although crude by rail does not become the major component on rail, it becomes a significant component. So when we start moving more and more unit trains going through communities, going through bridges, or going across bridges over big coulees, the risk of an accident, whether it's got heavy crude or light crude in it, doesn't matter, the risk of an accident goes up. But I come back to the point, in the absence of a new pipeline, industry is forced into going down the rail side of the equation.
So how do we mitigate the risk when it comes to transporting crude by rail?
Probably the safest method of doing it would be to construct at a very expensive price, a unique double-track system with fence borders so that no one can get onto the right-of-way, and basically run that straight from from the center of Alberta right into Texas or right into Cushing, Oklahoma, one or the other. And by doing that, you restrict any third-party incursions onto the rail line. By constructing it brand new, you would build all the latest safety features. The cars are now regulated that they have to be changed out, so it probably would become a very safe mechanism.
Well, it sounds very safe. Is that realistic?
No.
Okay.
It costs way too much money.
Okay.
But on the other side of the equation, if we build a new pipeline, whether it is through British Columbia or through the east coast of Canada or through the United States, the materials that are being used are modern age, high-strength steels. Safety precautions are monitoring all along the pipeline. Valve locations all have pressure monitors on them so that the slightest change in the dynamic of the fluid in the pipeline would cause a bell to ring in the control center, and the pipeline would be able to stop. You're still going to get ejections onto the ground, but it would be controllable in those environments. And trust me, I'm not suggesting the older pipelines don't have those on there. They do. They're just being retrofitted as time goes on.
All right. Peter Howard, thanks so much for your input on this topic and how to transport oil. We appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
So we've heard from experts from the oil industry, and one to ship by rail, one to ship by pipeline. But we have one group next that thinks neither option is a good idea. Joe Foy is the National Campaign Director for the Wilderness Committee, and he joins us from downtown Vancouver. Joe, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You have heard the arguments from both our previous guests. What were you thinking? What would you like to contribute?
Well, I think we're asking ourselves the wrong question if we're looking at pipelines or trains. An increasing amount of Canadians do not want us to be in the business of exporting this tar sands bitumen. Canada doesn't need to be in that business, especially in this era of runaway climate change. Not only Canadians, but people around the world are struggling to deal and to fight back against climate change, and expanding or even continuing the export of tar sands bitumen is moving us in the wrong direction.
But we do, at this point, it is a large part of our economy, and at least in the short term, this is going to continue. How do you think we need to do it safely?
It's a terrible part of our economy. No province or city, for that matter, wants to be hooked to the roller coaster ride of oil prices and the expensive tar sands bitumen. Much better to be an economy like British Columbia, which is a broad-based economy, or economy like here in Vancouver, where we make a good living out of our clean air, our clean water, and abundant resources and diversified economy. Relying on export of this terrible, poisonous, deadly product is the wrong way to go environmentally, safety-wise, and economy.
But this province also does have a lot of resources in it that do make up a large part of our economy, and some controversial resources as well when it comes to coal and things like that. When we talk about exporting it to other places, is it not best that we have some kind of strategy in order to do it safely and to maintain the parts of our province that we still want to keep?
Absolutely. We export manufactured lumber products. We export foods such as grain. We export a lot of materials. But you know, the hazardous material which causes the most accidents, the most grief, we just have to look at Lac Mégantic and the loss of life there. We need to look at the oil spill in Burnaby in 2007, a great big oil fountain. No other product, no other hazardous product causes us the grief, and we don't need this grief. We export a lot of materials, and we really need to be looking at what comes through our communities at midnight. And the most dangerous thing that comes on trains, the most dangerous thing that's coming through those pipes, is that tar sands bitumen.
And I think both of our previous guests would agree with you there, saying that rail does tend to go through metro areas, which is in some ways why pipelines are safer because they're going through rural areas where the potential spill wouldn't have the same impact. Do you disagree?
I understand that the oil industry wants us to frame it that way, but I think more and more British Columbians and Canadians are saying we need to scale down until we stop our tar sands exports. We owe it to the world, we owe it to ourselves, we owe it to our economy to build a resilient, broad-based economy and not let big oil trick us into the pain and suffering of a boom and bust economy as we're now seeing in some parts of the country.
Joe Foy, we appreciate your time this afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We are going